So here we have a process costing problem. Barsu Inc. uses process costing, and up here we see all of the data that we need to solve this problem. The first thing that you're asked to do is to calculate the equivalent units of production. So down here in part A, we're going to make that calculation. And always when we calculate equivalent units of production, we're going to start by looking at the number of units that were completed and transferred out to the next department. We're given that information right here. Units completed and transferred out was 10,700. So we're going to put that number both in the materials column and the conversion column. And remember, always, units completed and transferred out, they're always considered 100% complete with respect to everything, which is why we're going to enter this figure as a whole number in both columns. Next, we're going to look at the units in ending work in process. So we can see up here that there were 400 units in ending work in process, but of course they were not fully complete with respect to everything because they're still in process. They're still in work in process. So these units are 50% complete with respect to materials and 20% complete with respect to conversion. So we need to multiply these percentages by the units in ending work in process to get the number of equivalent units. So there are 200 equivalent units with respect to materials and 80 with respect to conversion. So then when we add these numbers together, we get to our total equivalent units of production for the period with respect to each type of input. Now the next step is to figure out our costs per equivalent unit. And to do that, we're going to first grab the costs in beginning work in process. And we're told the costs in beginning work in process up here, costs in the beginning inventory, and they're referring to the beginning work in process inventory. So there were $525 in materials costs and $16.96 in conversion cost. So we're going to put those beginning work in process costs in the appropriate columns. Then we're going to look at the new costs that were added during the period. So these are the new manufacturing costs. And looking up here, we see that these are the costs that were added to production during the month, our new costs. So we'll grab the amounts for materials and conversion, put them in the appropriate columns, and then we're going to add these numbers to get to the total costs. Once we have our total costs, we're going to go back and grab the equivalent units of production figures that we calculated earlier, and we're going to divide the total costs in each column by the total equivalent units of production for each of these inputs. Our answers down here represent the cost per equivalent unit with respect to materials and with respect to conversion. So our next step is to figure out what is the cost of the units that we completed and transferred out to the next department. We need to figure that out for our journal entry, transferring the costs out of work in process into the next department. And remember, we already found out previously that 10,700 units were transferred out to the next department. And again, these are the ones that we fully completed. So we're going to multiply these units by the cost per equivalent unit. And I've done this in separate columns, but I could have just multiplied the 10,700 by the total of 770 plus $20.90. And I would have gotten the same answer, but instead here what I've done is multiplied them individually and then added these two costs together to get to the grand total. So this 306,020 represents the cost of the 10,700 units that we completed and transferred out to the next department. Down here, we're going to figure out the cost of the ending work in process. And remember, when we go back up to our equivalent units of production calculations, we figured out there were 200 equivalent units in ending work in process with respect to materials and 80 with respect to conversion. So I'm going to bring those numbers down here and multiply by the respective cost per equivalent unit. So this amount here, the 1,540, represents the cost of materials in ending work in process, and the 1,672 represents the conversion cost in ending work in process. And when we add them together, we get the total cost of ending work in process. And this amount would appear on our balance sheet. So our final step is to prepare our cost reconciliation report. And remember, you're going to be given these prompts on the exam, but you'll have to know what numbers to put after the prompts. So what we're going to do here is we're going to account for all of the costs. So we're going to calculate the total cost of goods accounted for. In other words, we're going to explain where did all that money go. Well, some of the cost we transferred out. And on the previous page, we had figured out that this amount was the cost of the goods that we completed and transferred out. And this figure represents the total cost in ending work in process. So we're simply going to add these together to get this amount. And so we've accounted for all of the costs. In other words, we've explained where all of this money went. So the last step then is to look at what were the total costs that we needed to account for. Well, going back to the first page, the costs that we needed to account for or explain where they went were these: the costs in beginning work in process and the new costs that were added during the month. So this total plus this total equals this amount. And yes, the total amount of costs that we needed to account for are accounted for up here. So our cost reconciliation report is in balance, and we can have confidence in our calculations.